As we continue on today in teaching through the Bible, looking through these different offerings, these different sacrifices that we see in the early chapters of Leviticus, let's remember what we're learning here. What's significant about this? At the end of Exodus, we had that moment where God came to the tabernacle. Moses was not able to enter it. How can a holy God be with unholy people? To be with God, our separation from sin and separation to God is necessary. And this is answering how that happens for the Israelites in the wilderness and what that will point to for all of us, even in the New Testament. So we talked about two offerings so far. Two of the sacrifices are the whole burnt offering and the grain offering. But here we're going to have the next one is a peace offering. Some translations may say a fellowship offering. The word there is shalom for that offering. So this is the Hebrew word that means a peace, a wholeness. This is not a peace in the sense of, well, we're not fighting right now, right? It's a good relationship. You can be in a relationship with someone where you guys are at odds with each other, but you're not actually in an argument, right? Maybe the relationship isn't good, but you're not actually fighting at the moment. That's not peace. Peace isn't the absence of an argument. And a lot of people can get confused by that, thinking, well, as long as, we're not shouting at each other or, something like that, then everything's, we're at peace. But you're not really. You're not at peace until you have that good, solid relationship with each other, which we can't have with God when we have sin as a barrier. And so here, as we look at the peace offerings, then we're going to just look through some differences here than what we saw in the other ones. This one is definitely the one that's the most, I'm not going to say it's the most voluntary. There are some times when you need to be doing it. In the Old Testament, they come along with some other stuff, but you certainly have even what's called a Freewill offering, which is a type of peace offering. It's a peace offering that you're doing it because this is what you want to do. You have a situation where you're just thankful and you just say, you know what, I want to do this. Perhaps maybe a good comparison might be maybe you're in middle school, you're mowing the lawn as a summer job, maybe a couple neighbors mowing their yards, and you make some money, you give tithe to that. There's a lot of different views on tithe, but let's go with just one of the ones that I think is a pretty common view is that you should give 10% of what you earn to your church. So let's say you made $200 mowing all these yards over the course of this past week. So you need to give $20 to the church. And you say, you know what, I am so grateful. I'm so thankful to God that I have this job, that I have this working lawnmower that, maybe my uncle let me borrow and that's allowed me to do this job. I'm so thankful to God for the situation he's put me in. I want to give him $50. So $30 extra, that's part of that peace offering, if we're going to compare it to what's going on here. So that's kind of this free will peace offering. That's this optional thing that you're not required to give, but you're certainly welcome to. And in these, there's a little less regulation. You could even have certain defects in the free will offerings as far as what an animal can look like, because in most of these sacrifices, nothing can be wrong. It has to be absolutely just a blameless, perfect sacrifice. So in the peace offerings, there's a little more variety as far as what's acceptable. You also notice with the peace offerings, it doesn't matter if the animal that you bring, male or female. So that's another difference that we have, where some of these sacrifices, it's got to be a male. And then actually we'll see with the sin offerings, in one case it's supposed to be a female. But in this, it doesn't matter, male or female, in this case. You also see with these peace offerings another difference, which is that the person bringing the offering gets to participate in a different kind of a way. So whole burnt offering all goes to God, right? The grain offerings, you bring those. Some of these were required, like the first fruits, and you bring that, and a portion of it goes to God, and then the rest goes to the priest and his family. Here, these, you do have a portion that goes to God, and you also have a portion that goes back to the person that's giving the sacrifice. That person, they will get to eat part of this meal. And so in chapter 3, we see that with the peace offerings, that you get to participate yourself in eating some of this meal. And as do the priests. The priests get part of it. They have a designated portion that they get, and then you actually get some yourself. And I think what we're seeing here is showing how you have communion with God. You have this good relationship. You have a shalom relationship. It's a peace offering. And so this is something that shows that connection that you get to have with God. When you're in a right relationship with Him, you don't eat meals with your enemies. You're not. You wouldn't see in World War II. You wouldn't have seen, Winston Churchill from Great Britain and Hitler from Germany, just kicking back and eating some food together, having a peanut butter sandwich. That's not going to be something that would happen. Your enemies are at odds with each other. That's not the kind of thing that you would do. And here, though, God is essentially kind of having a meal with His people. We see this offering back when the covenant was ratified, back in Exodus. God made a covenant with His people back in chapter 24 of Exodus, and the meal they had was this kind of a meal. And so it's showing this connection, this relationship that they have together, this good, peaceful, shalom relationship. And so with that, that can maybe kind of point us forward a little bit to how Jesus institutes communion. Now, communion is most directly the Lord's Supper communion. That sacrament in the New Testament, it most closely would connect to Passover in the sense that He was actually doing Passover and then said, all right, now I'm going to institute this thing that we today often call communion or the Lord's Supper or terms like that. But the idea of that, the Lord's Supper, what that's showing is Jesus dying for us. That brings us into communion with God and also with one another as well. But here we get to see a little bit of that even in chapter 3 of the third book of the Bible, way back in Leviticus, how we have that connection with God. We get to be at peace with God. We get to eat with God because of this sacrifice. And so that's again, this is just another way that we're getting to see a little bit more about what God's planning, what God has in store in the future for God's people. Because at this time, obviously, Jesus has not come. He's not going to come for another 1,400 years or so at that point. But it's just a really awesome thing to be able to see how God is. Well, He's actually even providing for the priests in this. He's showing this peaceable relationship that He can have with His people. And it's not, again, fully shown yet. People don't have this full concept of how Jesus is going to come and solve this and make this a reality. But He's giving us a piece of that right there. And so now, as we've kind of looked at this next sacrifice, the sacrifice from chapter 3, let's look a little bit at the next couple sacrifices, talk about them a little broadly, and get back into that and finish talking about those next time around. So the next two, which I would maybe categorize a little more connected, at least in my mind, the sin offering and the guilt offering. And the difference between these two, you can kind of see a difference in how they practically look. But the purpose for them is going to be the sin offering. We'll see in chapter 4 that it says at the very beginning, and Yahweh spoke to Moses, saying, "Speak to the people of Israel, saying, if anyone sins unintentionally in any of Yahweh's commandments about things not to be done, and does any of them," and then it continues with, if he's this person or that, like which group is he with, what's his status in society, kind of thing. We'll talk more about that next time. But basically, this is saying unintentional sin. Then when we get, goes into about halfway through chapter 5, and then we get this section that begins talking about guilt offerings. And the difference here is, first, chapter 5, verse 14 says, Yahweh spoke to Moses, saying, if anyone commits a breach of faith and sins unintentionally, so still unintentionally, in any of the holy things of Yahweh, so talking more about sanctuary and things like that, then you have this guilt offering. Or chapter 6 begins, if anyone sins and commits a breach of faith against Yahweh by, then it lists things like deceiving your neighbor or stealing, things like that are, I'd say, pretty clearly intentional. Well, then you have this process. So you have some of those intentional sins that are listed here. And so the sin offering seems to be generally referring more to an unintentional sin. So maybe someone sins, they don't realize they sin. Later on, they realize that was sinful, and so they bring a sin offering for that. And talking about any of Yahweh's commands versus the guilt offering that's kind of more specific stuff, and there's more specific ways that needs to be addressed. And so those will be the next two ones that we're going to be talking about next time. I do think it is really interesting to point out one thing here before we go. At the beginning of chapter 4, I read, and you can see this in a lot of times throughout Leviticus, it says, and Yahweh spoke to Moses, saying, speak to the people of Israel. So there's a lot of times where it'll say, and Yahweh said, and that's like a whole big section. And that's most of Leviticus is, and Yahweh said, all this stuff. So some people will say, I only really trust maybe the Gospels because that's the words of Jesus. And sure, yeah, but this is the words of Yahweh right here. It's not like Genesis, which is a lot of narrative. It is just, here's the words of Yahweh. And so that's something to consider when people try to make that argument that, this is, I'm going to go with the New Testament stuff because it's clearer because, it's Jesus' words. This is Jesus' words just as much. So we'll end there and we'll look at the next couple sacrifices next time. Thank you for watching that video. I hope that it helped you learn a little bit more about the Bible today. And if you'd like to continue to learn more about the Bible, then we have plenty of other videos on the channel. And if this has been helpful for you, then you can always let me know by subscribing to the channel. And hopefully I'll be able to continue to help you learn even more about God's Word. Thanks.